Hello and welcome back to Retfurb. So on today's video we've got my Sony TA1150 amplifier, which I'm going to be giving it a much needed service. It's well overdue. The controls, mainly the volume control, is quite crackly when it's operated. Some of the others a little bit but not too bad. And also I'm going to be changing all the electrolytic capacitors on the amplifier. Now I've been meaning to do this for a while. There's no particular reason other than the fact that it's to prolong the life of the amplifier. I don't want any of the old capacitors leaking. You know, at the moment there's no sort of issues with the amplifier other than what I would say there's dirty controls just needing a good service. There might be some capacitors when I'm opening it up and having a look inside. There might be some that have started to swell. I don't know yet. But I'm literally just doing it because I want to prolong the life of the amplifier. It's my favourite amplifier. It's one that I use pretty much daily. So I just want to keep it in good condition. I'm going to be replacing it with quality capacitors, mainly Panasonic Nichicon, if that's how you pronounce it. They're the two main brands. I've got there's a couple other, but it's all good quality stuff that I'm putting in there. The two main power capacitors I've had to find, it's like the equivalent of that, which I found, which are bolt-on type ones. So they're exactly the same size as the old ones, but instead of being soldered on the top, they're going to be screw fit, should I say, at the top. So I'm going to be doing a bit of a modification with that, just fitting some ring type connectors on those. And yeah, hopefully then that'll then prolong the life and give it as much life as I've had already out of it. And the amplifier itself, I haven't owned it from new, it's older than I am. So yeah, hopefully it will go on for many years and, you know, continue to be as good as it has been since I've had it. So let's get into it. So getting straight into it, obviously this is the amplifier, the TA1150. Brilliant amplifier. If you get a chance to get one for a good price, definitely pick it up. So there's two screws either side, which are just Phillips screws, crosshead screws. So these just need to be removed and then the lid can be taken off. So nice and simple, and then you can get access to inside. Obviously when you do take it off, you want to make sure it's all safe. You don't want to be putting your fingers in anywhere which has got any electric going to it or any capacitors that have been recently charged. Obviously you run the risk of electric shock off them, so they all need to be discharged correctly. I do show shortly discharging the main capacitors, just checking them. They were actually low voltage anyway, but I always go over the capacitors and just make sure. I've made sort of like a special tool that just drains them with a resistor in it. So you can just see now I'm just removing the pieces that need to come off to get access to the inside. Just removing the faceplate first, and then we can get access to the controls and everything in behind, and just removing some bits in behind there. So this main face panel piece or framework that's behind the main plate, that needs to be undone, and then it can sort of tilt forward. You'll see in a minute I'll tilt it out of the way, and then you get access to the main capacitors, the two power capacitors, and also the board, which is separate from the front board, and then it will allow you to remove everything easier. So it's pretty straightforward, to be honest, this, in terms of changing the capacitors. When I first looked at it I thought it was going to be a little bit harder than this, but actually it's all pretty well located, and you know, you can access all the back of the capacitor legs to get the solder off. So it isn't actually that bad, to be honest. I found it fairly easy. I've done other ones that are a little bit more trickier. Now, on first impressions, looking inside, there's nothing that's, you know, that bad. It needs a good hoover and clean, which I do. And you can just see here I'm just checking the discharge and everything. I do go over the voltmeter as well, also, just to make sure there's no voltage in any of those. Obviously they can carry quite a lot of volts and you don't want to be touching any of that and potentially cause an injury to yourself. Yeah, as I was saying, it's pretty tidy in here. It's not too bad. It's just a bit dusty. Just needs a good service clean, really. Now I'm just removing the parts here just so I can get access to underneath of those, so I can remove the capacitors on that board. Just making sure that I make a note of where all the wires were plugged in. You don't want to be putting them in the wrong location. Also, whilst I do say that, you need to make sure with the two power capacitors you got them wired correctly. Now I had a manual as well, which I referred to for them, which tells you where the positive and the negative leads need to go, because it's slightly different. You don't post them straight onto the positive and the negative. They're sort of in series, so from one goes from the positive to the negative, the other capacitor, like that. It's hard to explain sort of just saying it, but if you've got a manual you'll see exactly what I mean. Just starting to remove the capacitors, what I've done is just mapped out the capacitors on this board on a sheet, and I'm just writing down what I'm taking out, purely because I'm going to do this in one hit. I wasn't going to, I was going to do it on one board, put it all back together, test it, make sure it's all working, but I thought no, I'm just going to go for it. Whether that's a good idea or not, probably not, but yeah, so I thought if I map it out, at least I know if I've made a mistake somewhere, I can go back and change it, and I know exactly what was what and what was in there. Also, the good thing about this board, and probably a lot of boards are similar, that it's marked where the plus and minus is. So on one side of the place where the capacitor comes out, you'll see there's a small little minus symbol. So it just makes it easier when you pull them out, you know exactly which way around it's got to go. Obviously just fast forwarding as I'm doing this, just using the soldering iron, my trusty Milwaukee soldering iron, which I love to use. It's not the most delicate of things, but it's ideal, you know, I really like it, and some people have said that it's a bit bulky, which it is, but I've had no issues with it. I've done some quite small stuff with it and I've always found it fine. And then just using the solder sucker to remove the bulk of the solder, removing the capacitor, putting the new one in, and then obviously using the soldering iron to melt the solder back in and making sure it's a nice good joint. So that's basically it. I'm just repeating that process on the whole lot. So now you can see that I've finished that board, and now I'm just going to bolt that back in and just get all those wires correctly located in the correct position. So with these wires as well, just making sure they're on correctly. There's a small sort of hole. If you look in the end of the wire where the plug goes on, you can see that the wire goes. It's quite easy to put it either side of that and it don't fit properly. So just make sure you've got that in right. You'll feel the difference. It'll be tighter once it's on correctly. So now just bolting this board down, nice and easy. It's just 4 screws on that one. And now moving on to the main front panel. So these capacitors are exactly the same. And to be honest, none of these capacitors were sort of causing me any issues. I've had some before where they've been stuck down with so much glue. They're a nightmare to try and get out, whereas these are not, so they're nice and easy to replace. Most of the capacitors for this amplifier are actually bought from, I think it was Mouser, I think that's called. I did get some from an eBay shop which I buy regularly from, and that's who I actually use now rather than Mouser. I find them cheaper from this eBay store that I use. But I bought these quite a long time ago and I had them in a box, and I've kept meaning to do this amplifier, and I finally thought the other day, right, I'm going to crack on with it, because I use it all the time and it's annoying that it's a bit crackly when you try and use the controls. So I thought, you know, I need to get on with it and get it done. So now onto the main capacitors. Now these 2 capacitors, the wire was wrapped round a lot and there was loads of solder on there, so it took me a while to get it off, and I had to trim a bit off the wires at the end because they were sort of wrecked from where they've been put on, and also trying to remove them. So you can see they're sort of like in series there, so one capacitor is joined to the other. So you just need to make sure that when you're doing that again, you put those in the correct wires. And now I'm just doing the service on the controls, just spraying some deoxit in, and then working the controls, get it all in around, making sure it's all nice and clean and lubricated. So after I did this and I tried the amplifier, there was a tiny little bit crackly at one point on the volume control, so I put a little bit more in there and it seemed to resolve it. It's quite difficult to get into some of the controls and do them correctly. You know, you could pull them right apart. Sometimes it's a bit of a risk doing that because of the way they're put together. Now with these you can pretty much get access from outside anyway on the sliders, so you can just spray in the deoxit and it normally, you know, does it well enough. And then just go in and all around the button controls as well, and just making sure there's a little bit around there. Again, with those you can't get it in there brilliantly, but a little bit of spray, hopefully it will penetrate enough. And then now on to doing the wiring for the main power capacitors. So now I've bought some small little rings that I'm just going to crimp onto the end gently, and then I'm going to solder them in. Now another thing I keep meaning to get is some helping hands. I think that's what they're called, which just hold the wires while you're trying to solder it. I had a nightmare holding it and trying to solder it. It was it was my fault. You know, I need to get it. I keep forgetting, so I need to order that, and then hopefully it'll make it a lot easier when I'm trying to solder. You can see just how difficult I was making it for myself, and the chance of burning yourself is pretty high. Just putting a little bit of heat shrink around the wire now, and then just using the soldering iron to shrink it on. And then I'm just doing this process to all the wires. I tried to join up a couple of them that were on the same capacitor before. Just join them up so they go into one ring rather than having loads of different rings. And now you can see I've got the capacitors in place, and I'm just now bolting them in. So I've got some small little Allen key bolts that I'm just securing them onto the capacitors. So now we're coming close to the end of this process, and as you can see, it's come out okay. And this is my setup that I've got in my main front room that I absolutely love. I wouldn't sell this one. I've sold quite a few different amplifiers now over time, but this one I really love it. So, you know, this one's going to stay with me. It sounds great. So yeah, it looks really good, really happy with it. I hope that helps the process. I know I haven't gone into really sort of fine depth with it, but you can see the process of opening it up and doing it, and just making sure you map out those capacitors when you take them off, and then you know exactly where they've got to go back on if you get any issues, or if you're unsure, you can always do it bit by bit. Do one board first, put it back together. It just depends on, you know, if you want to take the risk or not. Again, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. It's really appreciated. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.